Hi, I'm Mark Buckley. I'm bringing you part 2 of a message I'm doing from Romans chapter 1. We're going to begin in verse 18 if you want to get a Bible or open your phone. If you open your phone to Romans 1, I'll never know it, but it's a good thing if you've got a Bible app on your phone. It can come in real handy. So, this message is entitled, Understanding the Wrath and Judgment of God. When I was a younger guy, people would talk about hellfire and brimstone preaching, the wrath of God. Well, sometimes it says in the book of Titus that people need to be saved, or in the book of Jude, people need to be saved through the preaching of the fire. There is a reality that there's hell, and there's a reality that there's judgment. We're going to talk a little bit about this. It's throughout the New Testament. Jesus talked about burning and weeping and gnashing of teeth. The Apostle Peter said that it would be better to have never known the way of truth than to know it and then go back into error. Why? Because there's consequences for living your life in sin. Serious, eternal consequences. The Apostle Paul here is going to talk about wrath and judgment, but he's not going to be talking about it so much as a future wrath and judgment. He's going to be talking about it as a present wrath and judgment. Let me give you a couple of illustrations of this. I went to visit, and I've used this before, some of you may have heard it. I went with a pastor friend of mine, Highland, to visit his parents in Los Angeles a number of years ago. And his parents were a Jewish couple, and Highland was raised in a Jewish family, and he's a Messianic Jewish rabbi to this day. He loves Jesus with all his heart, and we had worked together for over 20 years. Well, we go to visit his parents, and they were law-abiding citizens who had been faithful in their work, faithful in their marriage, faithful raising their kids. And they were living in an apartment with bars on the windows, and not just a screen door, but an iron door that when you locked it, it was a security door. And they said they could not go out at night. They were afraid to go out in their own neighborhood. And I realized that a sense of judgment had come upon them because they were insecure and living in fear in the midst of Los Angeles, which is an all-American city. And it was very sad to me. I've also seen people, and I've seen this happen several times, weeping so intensely. Their bodies are shaking and trembling in grief and in anger. I've seen a wife do that when her husband has been unfaithful. I've seen a young woman do that after she and her boyfriend decided to have an abortion, and she went through with the abortion, and the reality, the consequences of what it did to not just her baby, but her own soul and her relationship with her boyfriend. I've seen this weeping, so intense. I've seen the after effects of divorce for men and for women. I saw a brother of mine just weeping after his wife left him. The pain and the heartache that can come when there's unfaithfulness, when there's desertion. I saw my own mother for 10 years weeping because my dad had left her, and she had wondered, what did I do wrong? She had been a virgin when she got married. She had 8 children. She had converted to the church of my dad. She wondered, she had tried to do everything humanly possible, but for whatever reason, it wasn't enough for my dad, and he wasn't faithful to her. And I tried to explain to her, Mom, it's not about you. It's him needing to find God. And so I'm talking about the reality that some judgment comes on people, some wrath comes on people, some pain comes on people. Why is that? Because the effect of sin can be horrific. And it's not Highland's parents necessarily, or my mom necessarily, or the woman whose husband was unfaithful necessarily. I mean, maybe if they had been closer to God and gotten off to the right kind of relationship in the beginning, they wouldn't have experienced some of these things. But maybe it's the sin in the society. And what we're going to discover at the end of this message is not given so that we become judges. It's being given so that our eyes are open, we don't make foolish choices, and we can help people get delivered from the consequences of sin. So, Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, it says this: "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." He does not say the wrath of God is going to come at some later date. He says it's being revealed right now. We're seeing the consequences of sin right now. He said this 2,000 years ago, and he's going to describe the kind of behavior that led him to see the implications of the behavior that led him to this conclusion. "Since then, what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." Okay. There is the wrath of God. Why is that? Because people know God. They know right and wrong. God's nature, the fact that there is a God, that he is powerful, that this world is not an accident, is clearly known to people. I considered the first truth I ever learned. I used to hitchhike across the United States. I had lost my driver's license, not in a couch somewhere, but in the court of law. They took it away from me. And so I had to hitchhike. And in the late 60s and early 70s, people were by the thousands hitchhiking all over the United States. It was a great way to get around if you don't mind standing out in the cold occasionally and waiting and taking 2 or 3 times as long to get to your destination as normal. It's still a great way to get around. But so I'm hitchhiking around, and I always got where I needed to go by the time I needed to get there. And it was like an eye-opening experience. Even when I went across the United States, I always got where I needed to go by the time I needed to get there. Now, I met some weird people. I met some guys that were weird to me and tried to pick me up sexually. I met some guys one time that pulled revolvers on me, 2 of them at the same time, and they demanded all my money, and that was a very unsettling, troubling encounter. But guess what? I always got where I needed to go by the time I needed to get there. The Lord protected me. And I gave those guys my money, and I said no to the guys that were trying to be sexually weird with me. I don't recommend hitchhiking as a great means of transportation, but for me, it was eye-opening because I realized life is not an accident. That was my first spiritual truth. It's not an accident. There is a power somewhere. Not just the power that keeps the earth at the exact distance from the sun that we need to be kept. Not just the power that rotates the moon around the earth so that all of our tides are balanced in the way they need to be balanced. Not just the power of God that summons the waters into the clouds and allows the clouds to pour down the rainfall we need to water the earth and grow the crops and have drinking water and sustain life on the earth. Not just those phenomenal powers, but there's the power that's calling us into relationship, which I said in the first part of this message. This is the second part of Romans 1. Part 1, we talked about the call of God, the value of the gospel, the value he puts in us. Now in part 2, we're talking about the judgment and wrath of God. The people are without excuse because God's nature is known through his power, through the things that he has made. There's no excuse for turning your back on it. If you turn your back on what God shows you, things start to go dark, which we'll see here in a minute. Verse 21 says this: For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Okay, this is part of the wrath and judgment of God. If you deny the truth that you know about God. See, he doesn't show himself to us fully. He shows himself to us in part. And when he shows himself to us in part, he's showing us that there's more power where this came from. There's more wisdom and more knowledge where this came from. And our responsibility is to seek God and to grow in the wisdom and understanding about the knowledge of God that we don't understand. Because the first thing you realize when you begin to discover there is a God is that there's a whole lot you don't know. There's a whole lot you don't understand. And I began to pray the prayer that David prayed in Psalm 25, where he says, Lord, teach me your ways so I can walk in your paths. In other words, I really want to know how you operate, Lord. Now that I know that you're there, that life isn't just an accident, that I'm not just stumbling blindly through the universe and trying to grab my portion of the goodies, now that I know that there is a God and he will provide, I'd like to get to know how he operates so that I can cooperate with his ways and I'm not just living in constant conflict or making the same mistakes over and over, learning the hard way. Anybody who continues to learn the hard way all the time is foolish. It's foolish to always learn the hard way. We all learn the hard way in some ways. We all learn how to be more obedient to God because of some of the discipline we get. But once you get the discipline, once somebody brings you some correction and you realize that they actually spoke the truth into your life to save you from perpetually making more mistakes, then it's incumbent upon you to cooperate and seek more of the wisdom. But these people, their foolish hearts were darkened. Why? Because instead of pursuing more truth from the God who created them and revealed his power, they decided, okay, it looks like he's not bothering me now, and I'll go do whatever I feel like it, whenever I feel like it. Nobody can tell me what to do. It says in verse 22, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. So these people, they say they knew God. They claim to know God, because sure enough, they did know there was a God. But instead of worshiping him as the creator, who in spirit and in truth, they made their own images of God. They were happy with their own little world, their own little Netflix and popcorn and immoral world that they were fashioning to make themselves feel good so they didn't have to be worried about having compassion for people that have less or responsible for their neighbors that had problems or whatever. They just wanted to live in isolation, their own pleasure-centered world. So they're basically worshiping man as the highest form of creation and the highest ideal, as if man was God. In other words, there's some person who has an ideology, and that philosophy that person is espousing explains or helps you rationalize your own sinful behavior, and you'll take that as your God. So, therefore, in verse 24, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. God gave them over. Like you're like a kid, or they're like a kid that says, I want to do it my way. No, I'm not going to take a nap. I'm not going to take a nap. I'm not going to take a nap. Finally, the parent gives up and says, okay, you don't have to take a nap. And the kid stays up until they have a meltdown and then ends up getting sick. And one bad thing leads to another because their parents eventually get worn down. Well, it's not that God gets worn down, but that he has given us free will. And he will not strive with us forever to do his will. He's not going to coerce us to do his will. It says God gave them over to the sinful desires of their heart, to sexual impurity. Sexual practice can either be in marriage a building block for a better relationship, or impurity means that you are corrupting yourself by engaging with multiple sexual partners, either physically or through pornography. You're doing it in the mind and heart. You're giving way to lust. And that impurity actually darkens you. That impurity actually pollutes you. See, purity, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, blessed are the pure in heart, they will see God. That's the reward for having a pure heart. You get to see how God operates. And I'm telling you, there's nothing more spectacular than seeing what God is doing and enjoying what God is doing. So it's worth saying no to impurity, because it's like the glorious sunrise of the resurrection power of Jesus begins to enlighten your light. And that's precious. In verse 25, it says, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worship and serve created things rather than the Creator, who's to be forever praised. Created things. It can be the car or the boat or the other house. It can be whatever you're possessing that's taking all your time and energy so that you don't even have time to seek God. I'm telling you, it takes some time to seek God. It takes some time to pray. It takes some time to study the Word. And all the time I hear believers say, wow, I really know I should do this, but I just don't have the time. Well, the reason they don't have the time is not because they have to work 16 hours a day at their job. It's because they have filled their lives with a whole bunch of other things. They've got a huge budget because they're trying to maintain a level of materialism that they think is going to bring satisfaction, and in reality it leaves them empty. Or they're filling themselves with so much distraction because they don't even want to feel their own pain. Now, I like a little healthy distraction. I play chess games online and stuff. I'd rather take out some of my aggressions against an opponent in chess with friends than being frustrated about the political process or whatever. I get the need for healthy escape sometimes, but we've got to have time for Jesus. And if you don't, then you're worshiping and serving created things rather than the Creator, and that's when your heart gets darkened. That's when you have a sunset over your heart rather than a sunrise in your heart. Because of this, it says, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. It's talking about lesbianism. And it's not politically correct in our society today to say that that's an unnatural sexual relationship, but that's what the New Testament says. Women exchanging natural sexual relations for unnatural ones, being inflamed in lust for one another. It's not a natural thing for women to be sexual with each other. It's not a natural thing for men to be sexual with each other. God made us male and female, and natural sexual relationships are between males and females, and healthy natural sexual relationships are the covenant of marriage, where people can express themselves, male and female, with no shame, no guilt. Because you know what? All of our bodies are flawed. None of us are perfect physical specimens. And yet, in the Garden of Eden, when God created Adam and Eve as really beautiful physical specimens, after they had sinned, guess what? They had shame about their own bodies. They were ashamed of their own nakedness. Well, Jesus can restore us so we don't have shame. We don't have guilt. Even though we're imperfect, we're made whole by Christ. We're made beautiful by Christ. And so we can love one another wholeheartedly, and in a marriage covenant, express that in the fullness of life. It says in verse 27, in the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. They receive in themselves the due penalty of their error. And what is that? It's a beautiful thing when a man is masculine. But a man who gives into lust for other men starts to act feminine. They do. They act, speak, and have mannerisms of a woman. And though a feminine mannerism is beautiful in a woman, it's not beautiful in a man. It's weird. It's shameful. This is what the Word of God says. It's shameful for a man to act like a woman. We're made as males to be men, to have the strength and dignity and grace of a man made in the image of God. And it's beautiful for a man to be a man. And it's beautiful for a woman to be a woman. But when people are inflamed with lust for members of their own sex, then women who are participating in these unnatural relationships start acting like men. And they take on the characteristic of a man. And that's depriving them of the beauty of their femininity. Just like it's depriving a man who does that kind of thing with other men of the beauty of his masculinity. So some people say, well, God created them that way, right? You hear people say that all the time. Why would you say it's wrong? Are you hateful? No, I'm not hateful. I mean, I'm not here to judge the person. I'm here to proclaim the beauty of how God made us. And yes, some men are tempted to have sexual relations with other men. And some women are tempted to have sexual relations with other women. And I use the word tempted because that's what Scripture talks about when we are drawn towards sinful behavior. I am tempted sometimes to yell and scream in anger. I am tempted sometimes. I've been tempted to punch people. I was tempted one time to punch my own wife. I'm so glad I didn't give in to that. You know, I could have gone to a counselor and the counselor would have said, if I told him the whole story, well, it's natural for you to want to punch somebody who treated you like that. Well, it might have been natural in the sense of me venting my anger, but it would have been so destructive in my marriage. It would have been so hurtful to my wife because I'm an imperfect person, and my impulses when my wife is doing things that hurt me are imperfect impulses sometimes. She is not trying to hurt me usually. She's responding in an imperfect way to the imperfect impulses I give to her. And so well, I'm saying all that to say this. Just because you have an impulse to do something doesn't mean that's how God created you and it's a good thing. Sometimes the impulses we have are because we're fallen human beings and we're responding to other fallen human beings. I come from a long line of alcoholics and adulterers. I've been tempted to be drunk, and I've been drunk, and it doesn't produce good things in me. I've been tempted to commit adultery. I've never committed adultery, but it would not be a good thing. It wouldn't be a good thing in terms of my relationships with my wife, who I've been married to for over 47 years, or my children who appreciate the fact their dad and mom are still together, or to my friends who look up to me, to other women who have come to me for counseling. They need to trust that I will resist impulses that are ungodly so that I can be a safe person who isn't trying to take advantage of them. I love my sisters in Christ even more than I love my internal impulses to do wrong. I love Jesus, who has given me the opportunity and the responsibility to be a spiritual father to people. That is a responsibility I take very seriously. Just like when I used to babysit other people's kids, I took that responsibility very seriously. They entrusted to me the ones that they loved more than any other human beings because they believed my wife and I would care for them in a right way. And I wanted to be able to show up when they showed up at the front door and say, here's your child back, and they're healthy, they're safe, and they've been cared for, and I have loved them just like my own kids when they've been in my care. I have done unto you as I would have you do unto me. I had to leave one of my sons for 3 weeks with friends when he was just like 3.5 years old because Christina and I were on a long trip, and they loved him as their own child and cared for him. And we were secure in that love, and he had a great time and was bonded to their family, and we got him back safe and sound when we came back from our trip. Now, you may never do that with one of your children. I'm not telling you to, but I'm telling you this, that you are called to be a responsible adult and to love your neighbor as yourself, love your brothers and sisters in Christ, and never to take advantage of anybody financially or sexually or in any other way to manipulate and control and abuse them. And when these people did that, the people Paul's talking about in Romans 1, they experienced consequences. Verse 28 says this, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done. They have a depraved mind. Most of the time if you sin, it makes you feel bad. First time I ever told a lie, it made me feel bad, really bad. First time I ever stole something, it made me feel bad, really bad. And I literally told my mom, I was 5 years old, I had stolen some Kool-Aid or something from our variety store where they sold candy and Kool-Aid. I felt really bad, and I confessed it to my mom. She knew something was wrong with me. She didn't know what, and I finally told her. And then she had me go back to the store and pay them 5 cents a pack for that Kool-Aid, And it felt a lot better when I had it paid off. It really did. Now, I went on to steal more, and I had a depraved mind for a while. I could look somebody in the eye and tell them a lie. I trained myself, and it's very dangerous when people do that. You can have what the scripture calls a seared conscience. Your conscience is designed to warn you when you're sinning, because if you sin, it's sort of like the warning of a hot stove, don't touch it or you'll get burned. You violate your conscience, and after a while you can sin and it doesn't bother you, but it's going to have consequences that are far-reaching. In verse 29, this is what the apostle says. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They're doing all these weird and bad things. You see, one bad thing leads to another. People don't just get involved in homosexual practices or adulterous practices. They actually go on to be judgmental and hating others and unfaithful and irresponsible. Most men that I know who have been involved in adultery, they'll look me in the eye and lie about it unless I caught them with irrefutable evidence, because those who commit adultery often lie. One sin leads to another. Those who steal a little bit, Jesus said, if you're unfaithful in a little bit, you'll be unfaithful in much. You sin in one area, you're going to sin more in another area. That's the way life works. We're made in the image of God. Either we cultivate that image and walk in the holiness that God's given us, or we don't. And when we don't, we become animalistic. And animals don't have a code of ethics. Well, you can say, well, I do, I'm right. You can't say everything I do is wrong. No, I'm not saying everything you do is wrong, or everything the immoral person does is wrong. I'm not even saying in this message that one form of sin is a lot worse than the other. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that sin has consequences, and sexual sin specifically is pointed out by the apostle, and I'm called to preach the whole counsel of God, not just part of the scripture, but all of it. He goes on to say they have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. That's serious when people lose mercy. lose love, lose understanding. It's all diminished because of their sin. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. That's verse 32 of Romans chapter 1. That's when people start saying that evil doing is actually good. They approve of those who are doing evil. That's when society is really scrambled. That's when people are really scrambled. That's when consequences spill over and cause trouble for all of us. For all of us. And that's what's happening in our society now. But it's nothing new. It happened 2,000 years ago. And it's happened many times throughout human histories. That's what causes societies and empires to fall, to implode. Whether it's the Roman Empire that collapsed, or the Greek Empire that collapsed, the Babylonian Empire that collapsed, they collapsed because of corruption, moral corruption. And if you have leaders that are morally corrupt, they cause problems and it spills over and we're all adversely affected. If we act that way, then the problems come into our lives. So how then should we respond? Okay, what kind of action should we take? Let me give you a big warning of what not to do from the Apostle Paul in Romans 2, verse 1. The very next verse, he says this: "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." What? I thought he told us the people that do these things are experiencing a darkened mind. I thought he said that God is turning them over, that they're depraved. I thought he says that God is just like abandoning them to this kind of behavior. Yeah, that's exactly what he said. But then he warns us. He says, we are not to be judging them. In other words, that's not our role as believers, to be the judge. God will judge the world. Now, we're to judge the church. It says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 that if anybody's in the church and they're practicing immorality or swindlers or drunkenness, we're to judge the church. But God will judge the world. If we start judging the world and condemning the world, pretty soon we don't have a relationship with anybody. I've got neighbors that are practicing these things. I'm going to be friendly to those neighbors. Why? Because I'm called to love the world. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. And the apostle specifically warns us that we do the same things. Well, you say, no, wait a minute, I'm not a homosexual. Well, are you disobedient to your parents? Are you without mercy sometimes? Are you someone who is passing judgment? Because when you are passing judgment as an individual on other individuals, you're actually passing a judgment that says you don't believe the law of God. The law of God says that we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. We don't want to be judged, so therefore we can't be judging others. We don't want God's judgment on us, so why are we thinking that we're supposed to be the agents of God's judgment on others? Does that make sense to you? We can recognize behavior and call it evil or call it wicked, but we're also to do that without being the judge of the people. Because you see, like, let me use my marriage as an example. I've been selfish, I've been lazy, I've been greedy. I'll take the biggest piece of cake that's left over on the plate. I'm greedy, I'm selfish. I'll take my time doing a chore around the house, even though Christina really wants something done. Do I really want her to judge me for that? Or do I want her to give me grace to get it done when the time's right? Or give me grace to have that bigger piece, more than my share, forgive me, or whatever. That's really what I want. And I'll ask forgiveness if I have been greedy or selfish, or if I've hurt her. I will ask forgiveness, and I don't intend to do that the next time. I want to be right. I want to be a blessing. So people that are acting contrary to the will of God, they're going to have consequences, all the consequences we were talking about. And they need to know that. That's my job, and your job is to share the truth so people can know there's consequences, but stop short of being the judge, because again, that's us getting out of the role of being ministers of the gospel and into a role that even Jesus himself, he said, I did not come to condemn the world, but to save it. John 3:17. Right after John 3:16, God so loved the world, Jesus says, the Son of Man did not come to judge the world, but to save it. We have come to save it. So consequences scramble people's lives. And when people's lives are scrambled because of consequences, they're hurting. And when they're hurting, sometimes they're open to hearing good news that Jesus came to heal the brokenhearted and to set people free and to bring comfort and forgiveness of sins. It's not just Christian families that have struggles and Christian marriages that have battles. It's all marriages, all families, and all relationships. That we all have struggles. We all have battles. So when you're doing it God's way, you have the best chance of reconciliation and living in peace because you're serving each other, you're loving each other, you're forgiving each other, and all the rest. And even with all that, it's still hard sometimes, isn't it? People that don't love and forgive and serve and act in responsible ways, people who don't honor the covenant of marriage, their lives are really tough because life is tough, and they're tough without a lot of grace and peace from God. That's our job, to help them know that grace and peace is available, not to judge them. So hey, thank you for being here today. Thank you for listening to this, and I hope and I pray that you will be a light in your community, a light to your friends, and that you will bring the good news that Jesus Christ is alive.